Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Seikel. In this episode, I will look at how I started to improve my accent when speaking Mandarin Chinese. We probably all know learners who developed fluency in their second language while retaining a strong accent. Sometimes speakers of one language background, say Spanish, are thought to have a stronger accent in English than those from another background, say Dutch. The reason, then, must be in the languages they already speak, right? Well, we could compare and contrast the languages to shed light on this question. For example, comparing the Spanish sound system with sounds in English, and then in turn comparing the Dutch sound system with sounds in English. This may help account for such accents. Doing this exercise, we will indeed find that the sound system of Dutch is closer to English than the sound system of Spanish, which would explain the apparent linguistic ability of Dutch speakers. So we could assume that once a speaker has gotten used to producing certain sounds, they may base their further learning on those sounds that they have already learned. While these assumptions sound intuitive and indeed form the basis of a volume of existing research, they're not quite as straightforward as they may seem. Studies have found that sounds that are quite distinct are often more easily learned than those that are only slightly different from the native language. When there are subtle differences between a first and a second language, learners can easily and sometimes wrongly assume that the second language is similar to their first language and use those sounds as they would in their first language. Let's look at an example from my day-to-day life. Each year when teaching a new cohort of students, there will be some students with unusual names that I have not come across before. Those are typically the names I associate with faces first, the ones I learn straight away. The names that are similar to others, then, may take me longer to learn. Of course, some students will stand out in other ways, those that are very chatty or those with green hair. Those are usually amongst the first ones that I learn early on. Anything that stands out seems to be easier for me to remember, even though I may not always be able to pronounce the names correctly when I first come across them. For example, I remember struggling with a number of Gaelic names, such as Neve, which is written very differently from what you might expect when you hear it pronounced. However, while struggling to pronounce the name at first, I remembered the person and the name immediately because her name stood out of the ordinary. Our attention to unusual things can be an advantage when learning another language, even if we're not able to use the different sounds correctly just yet. The difference lies in the raised awareness. So, when trying to determine whether a speaker will have difficulties with another language, we can't just look at the sounds that are different and may be difficult for speakers to pronounce. We also have to look at whether the distinctions are noticeable or only subtly different, which can have an impact on how easily they are learned. Let's look at English speakers learning Dutch and Dutch speakers learning English. If a sound stands out and is relatively easily pronounced, learners are more likely to remember it. It may seem unusual at first, and it may take some time to acquire, but once mastered, it will likely be used correctly. Listeners will probably have come across the throaty sound in Dutch that appears as the G in the written system, sometimes written GH. So, in the famous painter, who we call Van Gogh in English, this sound appears in Dutch, Van Gogh. This sound stands out to speakers of English as it does not exist in the same way in English. It's similar to the sound in Scottish, loch, but it's unusual at first, so English learners of Dutch will be very aware of the sound and consciously attempt to pronounce it in new vocabulary they're learning. They may not always succeed, as the sound may be more difficult to produce for speakers who are not used to it, but they will be aware of it. On the other hand, when learning words like hand that are similar in Dutch and English, and indeed hand is written the same in the two languages with the same meaning, The English speaker may assume that it is pronounced in the same way in Dutch. The Dutch speaker likewise may assume that it is pronounced the same way in English. However, that's not the case. While the English pronunciation is hand, with the so-called voice consonant, the voice D at the end, the Dutch spelling differs from the way it is pronounced, because, simply put, certain voice consonants, of which D is one, are not typically pronounced as voiced at the end of words in Dutch. Instead, these voiced consonants are devoiced, which in this case means that the D turns into a T. So, hand is actually pronounced hand in Dutch. As is the case of hand, this change in voicing is not always reflected in the Dutch spelling. Dutch speakers may, wrongly or automatically, assume that English uses the same devoicing rule at the end of words, using the inherent knowledge of Dutch when speaking English, which looks similar on the surface. English speakers learning Dutch, on the other hand, may pronounce the Dutch word with a voiced D at the end, just like in English, because that's the way it's written. The difference is subtle, and learners may not notice at all. Our discussion on accent and pronunciation can be extended to grammar. When a structure stands out, learners will be more aware of it and may, in time, master it more readily than a structure that is almost the same as in the native language and that can, rightly or wrongly, be assumed to be the same as in the other language. So, what about my Chinese accent? Being aware of sounds that stand out and sounds that are almost the same but not quite, I looked at the sounds of Chinese in a little bit more detail. There were sounds that were very different. Sounds that were pronounced at the bottom row of teeth, like xi and ji and so on. And then there were those sounds like the sound that is written R, like in zhen, that are really not like an R at all. I was struggling with these sounds a bit, and I started to look at how they are actually produced. Where are they produced? How can I do that myself? Being linguistically trained, I immediately looked up the International Phonetics Alphabet, also called the IPA, and tried to see what that said about these particular sounds. I also looked at descriptions of where and how these sounds are produced, and then tried to reproduce them myself. I was not always really getting it, and I was not always doing particularly well, but I was starting to gain an understanding of how the language was working in terms of the pronunciation. As I was learning, as I was going along, I started to build this into my routine, to eventually develop a better and better accent as I was getting more comfortable in the language. I'm not really what people would normally imagine a typical linguist is, someone who picks up a new language immediately and pronounces it perfectly to the degree where natives are impressed. For me, unfortunately, pronunciation comes pretty much last in my skill set, and I'm not that good at imitating. So I have to play to my strengths and weaknesses and take pronunciation with a grain of salt. While aiming to do the language justice, to pronounce words so that I can be understood, I don't really grumble too much at the beginning about having an accent. I'm not letting difficulties in the pronunciation hold me back when speaking the language. Eventually, through exposure to the language, my accent usually develops and becomes better. How is this the case, though? Don't we know lots of second language speakers who, after having learned English for a very long time, still speak with very heavily accented English? When a learner's language seemingly stops developing, linguists used to call this fossilization in the past. Today, we tend to take a slightly more balanced view, because proper fossilization as such is probably not really the case. The language always develops, It's continuously learned or attrited, which is forgotten, which we'll look at in a coming episode. But some learners seem to stagnate, while others go on to develop a more native-like accent. Of course, talent to imitate is really important. But even for someone who is not very talented at imitating, they might still be able to develop an accent that is very passable. There's something about consciously working on an accent, listening to yourself speak, and this can ideally be done by recording yourself and listen out for the differences as you listen back to your own language use. One becomes quite good at intuition in the other language when having learned the language for a while. So, after a year, I was able to tell whether others had an accent. I was also able to distinguish different native accents, so whether somebody was from the north of China, from Taiwan, etc., and we explored this in the previous episode. So, understanding when other learners had non-target-like accents also helped me understand where my own accent had issues. I was able to hear the issues with my own language. For me personally, it always involves some more conscious learning to get the accent right, or right-ish. Often that can be achieved through daily repetition, through understanding the differences in the sound system of the language, and then learning, consciously working on reproducing the problem sounds. It is hard work, but it is something that may work if that is what you want. I'm wondering what is more important. For a native speaker to be able to understand you comfortably, or to have an accent that is perfect and almost indistinguishable from natives. How happy are you in your own skin? To me, now at least at this age, an accent carries a feature of previous linguistic experiences that defines me as a person. Thus, through an accent, I can also showcase my own personality and my own background. And that may be something that I'm proud of, and something that I want to convey to others. Sometimes not fully getting rid of an accent can mean that you've reached a stage in your language learning or in your life where you're ready to relax a little. You may want to have a better accent, but the wish may not be as strong as the wish to relax a little or focus on other aspects of the language. Let's look back at when I was learning Danish at the age of 19. And at the time it was extremely important to me to fit into Danish society. Of course, there were those attitudes I was experiencing while in Denmark, but my age and maturity were also another factor. I was keenly reinventing myself at the time. I was trying to fit into my new surroundings, and this included imitating and perfecting the accent of those around me. I also wanted to shed my German identity. I wanted to fit into the country I was now living in. When I moved to England, over a decade later, I had learned to accept my background and I was no longer that keen to fit in. But rather, I was fine with my history and my life. I had my achievements, I had gained a PhD and so on. So, while my English was getting native-like, I didn't have the same urge to perfect it as Danish. And again, we looked at this in the previous episode. So what about my Chinese then? I was very happy with my background. People looking at me will immediately know that I'm not a native speaker of Chinese. So I didn't really have that need to fit in to the same degree that I had in Denmark. But also I'm feeling very comfortable in my skin and I'm very happy to display my various accents and linguistic experiences. But I felt a clear tug and an urge to develop a relatively okay accent in Chinese, simply because I wanted to be understood. Also, the tones of Chinese were quite difficult, and there were some sounds that I struggled with, so I spent some time perfecting these and learning them, and ensuring that I could reproduce them in a way that native speakers would understand. For example, I had a number of problem words or problem syllables. A syllable appearing in the countries Sweden and Switzerland. Jui, jui. I really struggled with because of the R in the beginning and then the uri sound afterwards. I had to pronounce this many times and do this with one of my teachers for a while as well, in order to get it relatively okay. I started to focus on how others were pronouncing those sounds when I came across them. And I started to look for materials online, videos on how to perfect your pronunciation, that helped me tackle some of these difficulties. This took some conscious learning and some conscious revising what I had learned. There was one technique I found particularly useful, and that is sometimes referred to as shadowing. This means you find a story or something similar that someone is reading, so you find spoken language, and you learn that piece yourself, to be able to repeat it alongside. I was doing this for a while, and I was finding that I was doing this more and more with very short chunks of speech. When I had first started learning Chinese, my audio companion was built up this way, that it would give you a sentence and then you'd repeat it. And I ended up just saying the sentence together the first time and then repeating it again afterwards, once I knew what was coming. I started doing this again later as I was listening to podcasts. So when there was a good expression that I really liked, I just repeat it out loud afterwards and thereby make it much more conscious. Any repetition and imitation works. So I was using shadowing in a much more shortened form. As my Chinese accent got better, I thought back to dialects and to the ways in which Chinese people speak differently depending on where they're from. My teachers were both from the north, so they were speaking with an Ahua accent, adding this R at the end of some words such as war and har and so on. I also had friends from the south, and I was hearing a lot of different input. But what was I going to do? This was a tricky one, as I wanted to speak relatively straightforward Putonghua, relatively straightforward Mandarin. But at the same time I wanted to sound natural and not totally stiff and formal. So I decided to occasionally throw in an R into the mix. I started to do this much more than I initially thought, and I ended up R-huaing everything and everywhere. When hearing a recording of my own speech, I was quite surprised and actually quite shocked by how rubbish it sounded. So I tried to come across all cool, but I had achieved just the opposite. This taught me to dial down the Ahua a bit, and I started to speak in a more relaxed way. When I felt like it, I'd use the Ahua expression, but I did not at this stage feel that I needed to be able to speak with a certain accent in order to come across well. For me, it was much more important to be understood. Again, I was considering my own strengths and weaknesses, and not necessarily speaking with a certain accent was okay. I had my native accent to fall back on, and I was quite alright with that.